History is rarely complete. What survives in public memory is often a fragment, sanitized for the record, stripped of its shadows, and shaped by the victors. Yet buried beneath classified archives, sealed intelligence reports, and forgotten testimony lies another layer of the Second World War, one filled not with triumph, but with unanswered questions. In dusty vaults beneath ministries in Berlin, Moscow, Washington, and London, entire files remain blacked out, missing, or deliberately destroyed. They describe operations that never officially happened, prisoners who disappeared without trace, and weapons shipments that should not exist. These fragments, scattered across different continents, speak to a war that did not end with the surrender in May 1945, but instead dissolved into secrecy, cover-ups, and shadow networks that extended deep into the Cold War. Each mystery is a reminder that beneath the visible battles and public declarations, another war was being waged, a war fought in silence, with coded transmissions, sealed convoys, and unmarked graves. What lingers is not the certainty of closure, but the chilling weight of absence. Vanished fleets, missing gold, erased prisoners, and unspeakable experiments. They leave behind only whispers, footnotes, and the uneasy truth that some chapters of the Second World War were never meant to be told. What follows are 4 of these suppressed stories, resurrected from fragments of intelligence intercepts, declassified dossiers, and survivor accounts. They are not tales of heroism or victory, but of secrets carried to the bottom of the ocean, locked in abandoned tunnels, or buried in the swamps of Eastern Europe. Shadows that refuse to fade, no matter how many archives remain closed. Chapter 1: The Vanishing U-Boat Convoy. In the final weeks of the Third Reich, as Allied forces closed in from all sides and Berlin smoldered under relentless bombardment, a peculiar entry appeared in decrypted German naval communications, dated April 21, 1945, and intercepted by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park. The message referenced Seawolf 2, a convoy of Type 1C U-boats departing from Kiel under sealed orders. The transmission bore the authority of the Reichsmarine Command and carried instructions for absolute radio silence. What stood out in the intercept was not only the codename, but the mention of cargo of highest priority. Intelligence analysts, already stretched by the chaos of collapsing German defenses, filed the report under restricted access, marked Admiralty only, and noted possible transfer of scientific personnel or weapon components. The Type 1C submarines chosen for the mission were ocean-going vessels, built for long-range operations. Their reach extended as far as the South Atlantic, even to the waters off Argentina and Brazil. By April 1945, Germany had little left to fight with, yet it still retained fragments of its scientific elite and, as later revealed, experimental technologies that both Allied and Soviet powers sought desperately to control. Within the convoy's sealed manifests may have been parts for a nuclear program, advanced torpedoes, or escape routes for key figures who had no intention of facing trial. Witnesses in Kiel reported crates loaded at night under heavy SS guard, stenciled with markings never seen before, a black sun emblem and numerical codes rather than standard logistics symbols. Some dockworkers later swore under interrogation that they saw metallic cylinders being hoisted aboard, guarded by men in Gestapo coats. British destroyers patrolling the North Atlantic received sonar contact on April 29th near the Azores, a region known for previous U-boat Wolfpack operations. Reports describe a faint echo of multiple submarines moving in tight formation, then silence. Depth charges were dropped, oil slicks spotted, but no wreckage was ever confirmed. By May 2nd, as Berlin fell, the convoy had disappeared. The Royal Navy noted the absence in its May operations report, but the entry was classified, withheld even from many senior officers. The official reason given: probable scuttling. Yet scuttled wrecks leave remains, and none were found. Years later, in 1947, the United States Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence compiled a document labeled Seawolf 2 Unresolved. Declassified partially in 1978, the file made cryptic reference to cargo not recovered, possible hostile relocation. Argentine naval archives revealed another layer of the mystery. A restricted entry from May 10, 1945, mentions an unregistered submarine docking near Mar del Plata. The entry is thin, but 2 local fishermen interviewed decades later described seeing a dark hull slip into the port after midnight, offloading men and heavy crates before vanishing again by dawn. The Argentine government, sympathetic to Axis fugitives, kept such records sealed, though rumors circulated of German engineers appearing in Buenos Aires in the late 1940s with unexplained resources. The theory of high-ranking Nazi officials escaping to South America is not new, but the scale suggested by the Seawolf 2 file points to something more deliberate than isolated flights. MI6 reports from 1952 reference South American banking institutions suddenly receiving large gold-backed deposits, traced to accounts linked with former SS men. The CIA, during Operation Paperclip, quietly investigated whether missing nuclear research components could have been smuggled out by submarine. One heavily redacted CIA cable, dated 1962, mentions remnants of Seawolf network possibly assisting hostile state. Though the state is unnamed, analysts speculate the reference was to Perón's Argentina or even early connections to Soviet intelligence. Skeptics argue that the U-boats were destroyed in transit, their wrecks lost in the immensity of the Atlantic. Yet sonar surveys decades later mapped hundreds of wrecks, but not a single confirmed loss matching the convoy's timeframe. Instead, scattered reports of unidentified submarine activity persisted into the late 1940s. A Chilean naval patrol logged a sonar contact in 1947, resembling a German U-boat design, long after the war was over. Brazilian archives hold a 1946 report of local villagers encountering German-speaking men moving inland from the coast with heavy cases. The chilling question is not simply whether these submarines escaped, but what they carried. If indeed they transported technological components, it would explain why Allied intelligence remained tight-lipped. By the Cold War's height, both the United States and Soviet Union had strong reasons to suppress evidence of Nazi technology being smuggled out, particularly if parts were incorporated into their own programs. Atomic energy, jet propulsion, and advanced torpedo design all showed leaps forward in the late 1940s. How? Much of that was fueled by knowledge carried on ghost submarines that vanished beneath Atlantic waves remains a question buried in secrecy. The story of Seawolf 2 also touches on the fate of the men aboard. Submarine crews were loyal, disciplined, and unlikely to survive a post-war Germany where surrender was inevitable. For them, escape represented not only survival, but service to an ideal that demanded secrecy until death. Several post-war interrogations of captured U-boat captains hinted at rumors. There was another fleet, one that was never meant to return. When pressed, most went silent, insisting only that they knew nothing. Historians combing Soviet naval records after 1991 discovered notes of intercepted Allied signals referencing the same vanished convoy. Soviet commanders apparently believed the British had concealed its capture to secure the cargo for themselves, but no evidence of such a capture has ever surfaced. Instead, the Soviets scoured the South Atlantic in vain, convinced that the convoy had carried either nuclear materials or key German scientists. One defector even claimed that Stalin personally demanded every file on Seawolf 2 in 1946, an obsession that never resolved. Today, divers continue to search. The waters west of the Azores are treacherous, with volcanic ridges and deep trenches swallowing wrecks without trace. Yet sonar scans have revealed nothing resembling a lost wolf pack. Museums in Argentina quietly display artifacts suspected of U-boat origin, though provenance is never confirmed. Survivors in coastal towns of Patagonia recall strange arrivals of foreigners in the late 1940s, always well-funded, always silent about their past. The convoy's disappearance remains one of the great maritime mysteries of the Second World War. More than ships lost in combat, it represents a possibility that secrets too dangerous to fall into Allied hands were deliberately removed from history. Whether it was treasure, technology, or men carrying knowledge the victors dared not reveal, Seawolf II endures as a file that both Allied and Axis powers chose to leave unresolved. It is the silence surrounding the case, more than any wreckage, that tells us how deeply its truth was buried. Chapter 2: The Missing Gold of Rommel. In the spring of 1943, as the Afrika Korps crumbled under the combined might of British 8th Army and American forces, a strange pattern of movement emerged in Axis-controlled North Africa. Intelligence reports intercepted by Allied cryptographers at Bletchley Park included references to Dorado, a codename unlike the standard operational designations typically used by German High Command. Dorado was not linked to troop maneuvers nor to air raids, but to cargo transfers, sealed convoys moving under cover of night, guarded by the remnants of the Luftwaffe in Tunisia. Decrypted fragments suggested crates marked with Reichsbank seals, loaded onto Italian merchant vessels bound for ports along the Tyrrhenian coast. The Allies, convinced it was another attempt to resupply Rommel, failed to realize at first that the convoys carried something far more valuable than fuel or ammunition. As Rommel withdrew toward Tunisia, witnesses reported German trucks arriving at docks under heavy guard, their cargo never inspected by locals. Italian dockworkers, questioned after the war, described long wooden crates carried aboard vessels bound for Naples and Genoa. Some swore they saw ingots stamped with markings of European central banks, seized from Jewish families' colonial treasuries, and looted North African institutions. These shipments, conducted as the Africa Corps collapsed, were curiously protected. Luftwaffe fighters remained stationed at small Tunisian airstrips, flying patrols long after their usefulness had waned. To the Allies, desperate to force an unconditional surrender, the insistence on defending these convoys seemed irrational, unless the cargo represented something beyond ordinary war supplies. By May 1943, the Africa Corps was defeated and Rommel had already been recalled to Germany, yet the mystery of Dorado deepened. British reconnaissance observed several Axis freighters scuttled near Corsica in the weeks following the Tunisian collapse. The assumption was that these were desperate acts of denial to prevent supplies from falling into Allied hands. But post-war naval salvage operations found no trace of significant military cargo aboard the wrecks. No munitions, no fuel, nothing but scattered steel debris. The absence raised more questions than it answered. If the ships had carried bullion or artifacts, where had they gone? The first concrete clue surfaced in 1944, during the liberation of Italy. Allied investigators within the OSS discovered Vatican banking records with irregular deposits during 1943, coinciding with the Dorado convoys. These records, heavily censored when released decades later, pointed to gold deposits shielded under ecclesiastical privilege, moved quietly through Vatican channels into Swiss accounts. The Vatican denied any knowledge, but the timing and amounts were too conspicuous to ignore. A declassified British Foreign Office memorandum from 1946 bluntly stated, "Substantial portion of Reich looted gold, likely transferred via Rome during Dorado operation. Vatican complicity probable." Complicating matters further were rumours of mafia involvement. Sicily, already a hub for smuggling under fascist and later Allied occupation, was perfectly positioned to serve as a transfer point. Interviews conducted with captured Italian gangsters in 1945 suggested that local families were offered a cut of the treasure in exchange for protection and distribution. If true, Rommel's supposed missing gold may have formed the seed capital for post-war organized crime empires in Italy and America. US naval intelligence noted in its 1947 report, Operation Underworld, that Axis funds may have entered mafia-controlled banks in Palermo and Naples. To this day, certain Sicilian families are rumored to possess vaults filled with bullion-bearing Third Reich markings, long since melted down or laundered into legitimate industries. Rommel himself remained a shadowy figure in the investigation. By late 1943, his role in North Africa was finished, and he returned to Europe. He publicly denied involvement in looting, maintaining the image of a soldier bound by honor. Yet intercepted Enigma traffic revealed orders signed in his chain of command authorizing the transfer of priority assets. The ambiguity persists. Was Rommel directly responsible, or did the Reichsmarine and SS handle the operation while his name became a convenient shield? Post-war Allied interrogations of captured SS officers hinted that Rommel had been deliberately kept unaware of the details, his military reputation too valuable to risk tarnishing with the stain of plunder. Still, the myth of his lost fortune clung to him, surviving long after his forced suicide in 1944. The missing gold resurfaced sporadically in Cold War intelligence files. In 1964, MI6 analysts declassified portions of a report titled Unrecovered Axis Treasures, noting persistent gaps in war loot accounting, probable covert circulation. The document referenced specific shipments from Tunis to Naples and unverified claims that portions of the Dorado treasure were rerouted through Spanish ports under Franco's regime. Madrid, ever pragmatic, provided sanctuary to fleeing SS officers, and the possibility that bullion financed escape routes through rat lines into Argentina or Chile is now widely accepted by historians. Former Gestapo operatives captured in South America hinted at vaults in the Andes, filled with Reich gold, used to sustain expatriate German colonies and post-war networks. Perhaps the most tantalizing evidence came from divers exploring the waters off Sardinia in the 1970s. While investigating a wartime wreck, they discovered a handful of gold bars without serial numbers, wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath collapsed hull plating. The ingots bore no identifying marks, only faint traces of Nazi-era chemical processing. Italian authorities quickly seized the find, but independent accounts spread through maritime circles. Whether this was a fragment of Dorado or an unrelated smuggling cache remains unresolved. Still, the discovery reignited speculation that much of the treasure lies hidden beneath Mediterranean waters, deliberately scattered across multiple wrecks to ensure its survival. The legend of Rommel's gold gained further traction in political scandals of the 1980s. Journalists investigating mafia infiltration into Italian banking uncovered references to the Old Fund, a term whispered in Palermo boardrooms. Some claimed it referred directly to Dorado, a hoard siphoned through generations of criminal families. Meanwhile, Swiss vaults, long protected by banking secrecy, remained under suspicion. Several anonymous whistleblowers insisted that banks in Zurich and Geneva still held bullion traced to Nazi looting, moved there under Vatican mediation. The absence of transparency ensured the trail remained cold. What makes the story of Rommel's missing gold so enduring is not merely the value of the treasure, but the networks it may have financed. If Dorado's hoard seeded mafia operations, bolstered Vatican coffers, and fueled rat lines for fleeing war criminals, then its shadow extends across the entire post-war order. Its disappearance represents more than stolen wealth. It symbolizes the continuation of war in another form, fought not with tanks and artillery, but with money, secrecy, and silence. The trail of Dorado, fragmented and contested, offers only pieces of a puzzle deliberately scattered by those who benefited most from its concealment. Today, divers still scour the Tyrrhenian depths, scanning wrecks with sonar and submersibles, searching for the lost bullion. Archivists continue to sift through Vatican records, though key files remain classified. Survivors' families speak of whispered confessions, of fathers and grandfathers who once carried crates into tunnels and never saw them again. The mystery of Dorado is not confined to the war. It bleeds into the decades that followed, shaping crime, politics, and covert finance. The unanswered question lingers. Was Rommel's missing gold truly lost? Or was it transformed into the invisible currency of power that shaped the second half of the 20th century? Chapter 3. The Secret of Unit 731. In the frigid plains of occupied Manchuria, concealed behind the barbed wire of a complex officially designated as the Kwantung Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, the Imperial Japanese Army conducted one of the darkest programs of the Second World War. Known only by its code, Unit 731, the installation was located outside the city of Harbin. From 1936 until Japan's surrender in 1945, it functioned not as a medical research facility, but as a site of systematic human experimentation. Prisoners of war, civilians from China, Korea, Mongolia, and even captured Soviets were subjected to experiments in biological warfare, chemical exposure, and deliberate infection. The purpose was clear: to create weapons of mass death that could cripple enemy populations, while also testing the limits of human endurance. For years, the existence of Unit 731 remained an unacknowledged rumor, its records destroyed, its survivors silenced, and its perpetrators quietly absorbed into post-war power structures. Survivor testimony describes the camp as a sprawling complex of brick barracks, laboratories, and underground chambers. Prisoners were confined in maruta, or wooden logs, the dehumanizing term used by Japanese doctors and guards. Within these chambers, captives were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Some were vivisected without anesthesia, their organs examined while still alive to observe the progress of infection. Others were subjected to frostbite trials, their limbs frozen solid in the brutal Manchurian winter before being shattered to study tissue decay. Documents captured by Soviet forces in 1945 recorded grotesque experiments with pressure chambers, flamethrowers, and chemical agents. The human suffering within Unit 731 defies imagination, yet for decades the truth was buried beneath Cold War secrecy. When the Kwantung Army collapsed in August 1945 under the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Unit 731 received direct orders to destroy all evidence. Laboratories were torched, prisoners executed, and records burned in mass pyres. Yet not everything was lost. The Soviets seized partial archives, including testimonies from captured doctors and technicians. In December 1949, during the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, the USSR revealed chilling details of Unit 731's operations. Witnesses testified to plague bombs tested on Chinese villages, porcelain shells designed to shatter and release fleas infected with bubonic plague, and large-scale field trials that resulted in thousands of civilian deaths. The evidence was damning, yet the trial received little global coverage. Western governments dismissed the proceedings as Soviet propaganda, a convenient narrative during the early Cold War. But buried within classified US military archives, another story unfolded: American intelligence, particularly the US Army's Chemical Corps and the nascent CIA, recognized the strategic value of the data gathered by Unit 731. In 1947, under the guise of Operation Paperclip and related programs, American negotiators struck secret deals with Japanese scientists. Senior figures such as General Shiro Ishii, the commanding officer of Unit 731, were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of research results. Declassified memoranda from the National Archives, released in fragments during the 1990s, confirm that American officers described the data as unique and of great value to US biological warfare programs. Instead of facing trial, Ishii and his colleagues lived in freedom, some even advising post-war Japanese government agencies, while their victims were consigned to silence. The moral cost of this decision is staggering. Survivors of Harbin and surrounding regions, many permanently scarred by disease outbreaks, were ignored or dismissed. In China, local populations whispered of villages struck by strange epidemics in the 1940s, their origins unexplained. Farmers recalled fields where plague bombs had been tested, leaving blackened corpses and abandoned homes. Testimony smuggled out in the 1950s spoke of mass graves, hastily dug as Soviet forces approached, where prisoners were dumped after failed experiments. Yet international recognition remained absent. The United States, now locked in confrontation with the Soviet Union, preferred silence to justice, ensuring that Unit 731's crimes faded into obscurity outside East Asia. The Cold War saw fragments of Unit 731's knowledge resurface in disturbing ways. During the Korean War, North Korea and China accused the United States of deploying biological weapons, including plague and cholera agents. American officials vehemently denied the charges, dismissing them as communist propaganda. Yet classified Soviet intelligence reports, later uncovered after 1991, suggest that the techniques described bore uncanny resemblance to those developed at Harbin. Whether or not these weapons were actually deployed, the accusations underscore the reality that biological warfare research did not end in 1945. It merely shifted its center of gravity. The specter of Unit 731 haunted every laboratory where scientists pursued pathogens as instruments of war. The secrecy extended beyond geopolitics. Within Japan itself, the story of Unit 731 was suppressed for decades. Textbooks glossed over the atrocities, survivors were pressured into silence, and officials denied knowledge. When fragments of testimony emerged in the 1980s, Japanese courts dismissed compensation claims from Chinese victims, citing lack of official recognition. It was not until the 1990s that Japanese media began to confront the full scope of the crimes, driven by the efforts of activists and historians who unearthed evidence long buried in municipal archives. Even then, the government resisted formal acknowledgement, wary of diplomatic fallout and national shame. Visual motifs recur in survivor descriptions: snow-covered barracks under a pale Manchurian sky, black smoke rising from burning records, and the muffled cries of prisoners carried across frozen fields. These images, preserved in testimony and declassified reports, illustrate a world where science was weaponized against the most vulnerable. The sterile language of military memoranda, data acquisition, field trials, subject mortality, masks a reality of unimaginable cruelty. The calculated detachment of Unit 731's doctors, many of whom later enjoyed comfortable post-war careers, reveals how easily ethics collapse under the weight of militarism and secrecy. One chilling example comes from testimony at Khabarovsk. A Japanese physician admitted to infecting prisoners with plague, then releasing them into surrounding villages to observe the spread. When the disease decimated civilians, The outbreak was carefully documented, then erased by burning infected homes. Another experiment involved deliberate starvation, where prisoners were fed only sawdust mixed with minimal protein to study nutritional decline. Such accounts highlight not only the scientific ambition, but the complete dehumanization that defined the program. Prisoners were never patients. They were variables in a vast experiment in death. Even today, questions linger about the extent of Unit 731's legacy. Did American biological warfare programs in the 1950s and 1960s incorporate its data? Were Cold War experiments in Fort Detrick and Dugway proving ground built upon Japanese atrocities? Declassified files remain heavily redacted and official acknowledgement is scarce. Meanwhile, in Harbin, the ruins of the facility stand as a museum, a grim reminder of crimes that remained hidden for decades. Visitors walk through reconstructed laboratories, viewing rusted surgical tools, preserved documents, and photographs smuggled from archives. Yet many of the most critical files remain sealed in American and Japanese collections, shielded under the rationale of national security. The secret of Unit 731 is not merely a tale of wartime brutality. It is a story of silence, complicity, and the willingness of nations to sacrifice justice for power. By trading immunity for knowledge, the United States ensured that the voices of thousands of victims would remain unheard. Their suffering transformed into footnotes in scientific reports. The Soviet Union, while publicizing some evidence, exploited the atrocities for propaganda, never pursuing wider international accountability. Japan itself preferred denial and erasure, leaving survivors in a limbo of unacknowledged pain. The result is an enduring shadow, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are often preserved not in open memory, but in classified archives and whispered testimony, waiting for the day when silence finally breaks. Chapter 4: Stalin's Disappearing Prison Train. In the summer of 1944, as the Red Army surged westward through eastern Poland and German forces collapsed in retreat, a convoy designated Train 748 departed the city of Lwów under orders of the NKVD. Witnesses recalled its departure on July 22nd, a column of sealed cattle cars guarded by Soviet troops in black greatcoats, their rifles glinting in the pale light of dawn. The manifest listed priority detainees, a phrase that often concealed more than it revealed. Among them were Polish Home Army officers, Catholic priests, intellectuals, and suspected Western agents captured in underground resistance operations. Families gathered along the tracks, straining for glimpses of loved ones pressed against barred windows. For many, that was the last sight they would ever have. The convoy rumbled eastward, its destination officially recorded as Moscow, but no such arrival was ever documented. The train vanished into the swamps and forests of the borderlands, leaving behind only silence. The NKVD maintained meticulous records, yet the files on Train 748 are riddled with contradictions. One report, discovered in partially declassified Soviet archives, claimed the prisoners perished in accidental derailment. Another stated they were executed at transit, order of higher authority. Still another suggested they were absorbed into Gulag intake in Vorkuta, though no intake logs ever corroborated such numbers. The discrepancy alarmed post-war investigators, but requests for clarification were buried beneath layers of Soviet secrecy. Polish exile groups in London pressed Allied governments for answers, but the matter was quietly shelved, overshadowed by Yalta and the necessity of alliance with Stalin. The disappearance of the train became a phantom case, whispered of in émigré circles, never addressed openly on the world stage. Survivors' testimonies add a chilling layer. In 1947, a Polish railway worker who had defected to the west recalled seeing Train 748 halted near the Pripyat marshes, its cars surrounded by NKVD engineers laying explosive charges along a sidetrack. He claimed the cars were shunted onto a makeshift line, then detonated, burying prisoners alive beneath collapsed earth and timber. His account was dismissed at the time as hearsay, but decades later, declassified CIA debriefings revealed similar testimonies from other defectors. One Soviet engineer confessed under interrogation that he had been ordered to seal the cargo permanently, language cold and bureaucratic, but unmistakably fatal. The image of hundreds entombed beneath swamp mud is one that haunted Polish memory, passed on in whispers, never acknowledged in official communiqué. The silence surrounding Train 748 was not accidental, it was deliberate policy, By the 1950s, the CIA had compiled extensive files on Soviet disappearances, including the Katyn massacre and other mass executions. Within these files, references to the ghost train of Lwów appear repeatedly, always couched in uncertainty, always marked by redacted names. Analysts speculated that the prisoners represented a particularly sensitive category, perhaps agents with ties to British intelligence, or political leaders who could not be allowed to re-emerge in post-war Poland. Eliminating them ensured that Soviet-installed authorities in Warsaw faced no organized opposition. Yet the cost of acknowledging such an atrocity was too high for both East and West. For Moscow, it risked revealing the brutality of NKVD methods. For Washington and London, it threatened to destabilize fragile post-war arrangements. The fate of the train was buried under layers of geopolitical necessity. Fragments of evidence continued to surface. In the 1960s, Polish émigré newspapers in Paris published claims that aerial reconnaissance during the Cold War had identified mass graves near Pinsk. When researchers petitioned the Polish People's Republic for access, they were denied. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Polish investigators gained partial access to NKVD archives. Yet the files on July 1944 were conspicuously thin. Entire folders missing, registry numbers skipped, and references to Train 748 reduced to single-line notations. Detainees transferred, status concluded. Survivors' families traveled to the Pripyat marshes with ground-penetrating radar, uncovering human remains scattered in shallow pits, but no definitive evidence of the train itself. What they found confirmed murder, but not the method. The haunting element of Train 748 lies not only in its disappearance, but in the deliberate erasure of memory. Unlike Katyn, which eventually received partial acknowledgement, this case remains officially unresolved. Historians argue that Stalin himself may have ordered the obliteration, fearful of leaving alive any cadre of Poles who could contest his post-war designs. The Warsaw Uprising, which began weeks later, underscored his unwillingness to tolerate independent Polish resistance. To eliminate its leadership quietly, without spectacle, a disappearing train was more efficient than public executions. It left no trial records, no photographs, only rumors carried by survivors who were never supposed to exist. Visual motifs recur in survivor recollections: the stench of tar and oil as the train pulled east, the endless forests closing in, the eerie silence as guards barred windows with planks. Prisoners scratched messages into the wooden walls, hoping someone would one day read them. Decades later, fragments of planks allegedly recovered from the marshes bore initials and dates carved in desperation, fading testimonies of the condemned. Each piece reinforced the sense of lives deliberately erased, their only memorial a vanished convoy of iron and wood. The implications of Train 748 reach beyond the tragedy of its victims. It represents a method of state control perfected under Stalin, the disappearance as political weapon. No body, no record, no acknowledgement, only silence. For Poland, it was another wound layered atop the scars of occupation, partition, and betrayal. For the Soviet Union, it was a reminder of the reach of its security apparatus, capable of erasing not only individuals, but entire groups from history. For the West, it was a file marked too dangerous to pursue, sacrificed for the illusion of post-war stability. The truth, like the train itself, was buried in the marshes, left to rot in darkness. Today, historians continue to piece together fragments. In 2010, a Polish research team excavating near the Belarusian border reported finding rusted fragments of rail ties and charred metal consistent with wartime demolition. The discovery was quietly archived, overshadowed by contemporary politics. Survivors' families hold memorials in Lwów and Warsaw, carrying photographs of those who vanished on July 22, 1944. Yet no government has ever issued a definitive statement. The train remains a ghost, its passengers lost in the shadows of history, denied even the dignity of recognition. Stalin's disappearing prison train endures as one of the Second World War's most chilling mysteries, a symbol of silence weaponized, memory erased, and justice forever deferred. The deeper we travel into the shadows of war, the clearer the pattern becomes. What is absent speaks louder than what is recorded. U-boats that never surfaced, treasure that slipped through scuttled hulls, archives scrubbed of testimony, and trains that never arrived. All point to a world where disappearance itself became a weapon. These mysteries endure not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the truth was deliberately buried beneath layers of secrecy, denial, and silence. Governments chose to protect fragile alliances rather than confront atrocities, to absorb forbidden knowledge rather than prosecute those who created it, to erase the condemned rather than allow them to resist. And so the war never fully ended. It lingered in hidden laboratories, sealed bank vaults, forgotten ports, and marshes that swallowed trains whole. Each fragment that emerges from a declassified file or a survivor's confession reminds us that history is not a fixed ledger, but a battlefield of memory, where power decides what is revealed and what is destroyed. The ghosts of World War II remain with us, not as relics of the past, but as unresolved cases that challenge our understanding of truth. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a submarine graveyard may still cradle secrets too dangerous to name. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, bullion may still lie buried in silt. Somewhere in American or Russian vaults, files on Unit 731 remain sealed. And somewhere in the Pripyat marshes, iron rails may still hold the last trace of a train Stalin made disappear. Until these shadows are confronted, the war remains unfinished.